Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Tonight, we are live and we're going to be doing a response to some articles written about Christian nationalism from Big Eva herself. And these are articles from Josh Bice, Virgil Walker, and Peter Schreiner, I think was his name, of the Gospel Coalition. The first two were of G3 Ministries. This latter one was the Gospel Coalition. And you got some people at G3 just kind of clowning themselves. They've kind of become the butt of several memes. And we're definitely here for that. But we're going to engage more with the articles all as a whole because I feel like it'd be better to do it all in one rather than three separate videos addressing three separate articles. So that's the goal for this live stream. So we're going to be efficient in covering three in one. So that's the plan for tonight. So, and I would like to remind you, live chat is always welcomed. Hitting the like button is especially welcome. And Anthony is joining me here today. And just as full disclosure, how many of the articles have you read?
The Virgil Walker one, yes. The Gospel Coalition, and the other one I might have read through, but I'm not sure I retained a whole lot from the first G3 article.
Okay, just full disclosure, I read the first sentence of the Virgil Walker article, had a problem with it. I read the Josh Bice article already the other day and sent out a post about it, and I characterized it as dishonest. And I didn't think that he was serious about engaging this topic. That's how I feel about the Josh Bice article and G3 in general these days. And we're going to talk about one line in particular in the Josh Bice article that, they really don't have a good precedent to stand on with the people that they're raising up as faithfully participating in the public sphere. So that drove me nuts. And the first sentence of the Virgil Walker article, which is the only sentence I've read, but I had a major issue with. And it's not, he said some things that Christians shouldn't say, or at least he said one thing that Christians shouldn't say. And then the Gospel Coalition article I've read the least of, and it does, but I skimmed it enough to see, okay, you really go there. You go full blue and on or something like that. Like that's the vibe that I'm getting from that article. I haven't read it fully. K Pope says Joel Webben did a good video on where he stands on Christian nationalism. He does a lot of good videos on this topic. I have not watched them all yet because I've been behind on watching things. But yeah, definitely send live chat. We'll love to interact with you because we don't do too many live streams on the Gospel Coalition for starters, and certainly not on G3. This is the only second time I've talked about G3. Just because they're usually one of the good guys, and that's frustrating on this issue because they're either one of the good guys or they're absent in the fight. That's my experience with G3, or my observation of G3, which I'll talk about when we get to their articles. But I do want to let everyone know, Evangelical Dark Web, Christian news gathering commentary ministry. You can support us over at evangelicaldarkweb.org/join. This is our Patreon-like system that gives you more access to more content. There's content behind a paywall and stuff. And one of the things that I did recently was I did an Ask Me Anything type of article. And that way, if you're a paid subscriber, we're going to do an Ask Me Anything stream one of these days. And, if you're a paid subscriber supporting Evangelical Dark Web, one of the benefits is you get to ask us anything and we'll answer it when we do that stream, which should be a fun time. You will get prioritized. Live chat will always be accepted, though. So definitely hit the like button, and live chat is always welcomed. I want to read this one. Joel Webben brags his new book is getting positive reviews from Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk. Red flag. I'm not entirely sure about that because book endorsements are book endorsements. It's kind of like political endorsements. You don't even meet the candidate. You already have a prepared statement. The reason why Ben Shapiro would endorse this book is because it's not going to be a bestseller. And he can sustain some sort of conservative credentials, and it's not going to be a bestseller. It's not threatening him.
Kirk will endorse anything. Let's just be honest.
Charlie Kirk is a massive grifter. So yes. So, with that said, let's just hop on into our first article. Let me pull it up. Uh, the Different Shades of Christian Nationalism by Josh Bice. And we talked about Josh Bice, G3, and Christian nationalism and how they're just, really failing at it. This is their article to engage seriously on the topic. And I don't think this is a serious article. Um, Perhaps you're a Christian who lives in America and you've been concerned with the direction of our nation over the last several years. Okay, I'm going to max zoom in on that so the audience can read it. That concern is not unmerited. We have watched the nation legalize homosexuality, embrace critical race theory and intersectionality, and now we're currently debating the proper age for butchering children for sex change procedures.
Don't
Good
worry,
first,
Chris. Don't
much
worry,
better
Christian.
start than Virgil Walker's article, by
Christian
the way.
nationalism's the real problem.
Yes. If you have a problem with legalized grooming of children by Drag Queen Story Hour at your local community library, the insistence that Christians embrace the latest alphabet soup of pronouns and homosexual titles, and you disagree with the degradation of our sense of morality as a nation, what's the answer? For some, it's Christian nationalism. So, what is Christian nationalism? And should we, as Christians, embrace this movement as to answer the decline of our great nation? In order to deal with this issue, I will attempt to provide some basic definitions and move to a stated position by way of conclusion. Okay. What is nationalism? According to Merriam-Webster, the term nationalism refers to loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially in a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and proclaiming primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interest as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups. While this is similar to patriotism, it's distinct in that it elevates one nation above all others. It would be good to avoid using these terms interchangeably, and I disagree with that. There's our first disagreement there.
I mean, the line between nationalism and patriotism is very thin. And again, when your mantra for foreign policy or trade policy is America first, you are inherently putting your country's interest above other countries'
Right.
interest.
So, on one hand, we have to question, well, in what context is this true? In what context does nationalism exalt its own nation above other nations?
I mean, really,
And you're saying in its own policy that America first is clearly the example of that.
the problem with patriotism, so to speak, and based on his distinction between patriotism and nationalism, not my own, is that yeah, we fought how many wars for patriotism in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this whole war on terror and helping out Ukraine. That's patriotism because now we're not exalting our own interest above all other nations'
Right.
interest. And
I mean,
these,
those wars are criticized as imperialist, but they're literally the exact opposite of imperialism. Imperialism is when you impose your culture on someone else and benefit, the nation benefits at the expense of the action. Like, we're conquering the Philippines or, from the Spanish or manifest destiny. Those benefit the nation. Like when we're building roads in Afghanistan and spreading democracy, we're not benefiting America. And, that was a lie, spread, for several decades in American politics that democracy makes a nation friendly towards us, even though we have a long history in Middle Eastern politics in which dictatorships were actually most friendly towards us. Was it the Egyptian guy that was overthrown, Mubarak? And then obviously the Shahs of Iran were very friendly towards U.S. interest. So, and they weren't overthrown for freedom. They were overthrown because they weren't Islamic enough. And that's the truth about the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And it's also the truth about the Muslim Brotherhood Revolution, Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, or is it 2012 at this point? Over 10 years ago.
but
So,
his definition falls into that trap of I mean, again, to refer to Vodi Bakum's definition, that he emphasizes nationalism as the alternative to either globalism or probably like a local or tribalism, which again,
That's
Vodi,
the nationalism versus globalism versus tribalism's the how Doug Wilson frames this debate,
yes, that's how Doug Wilson,
and
Stephen
then
Wolf
Joel
framed,
Webben also frames the debate. So
but he
Stephen Wolf
is,
does as well.
yes, that's more or less Stephen Wolf's position is that you need the nationalism to combat globalism because you have a citizenry of not nowheres, as he calls them, basically global citizens or citizens of no country. So in
Uh,
order to combat that, you need people that take up a particular nation's interest.
the other thing that nationalism, in when he talks about not using the terms interchangeably, the other thing that nationalism stands distinct from his definition of patriotism is that nationalism doesn't celebrate multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is this. I would define multiculturalism as believing that all cultures are equal or have values to bring to the table. And that's simply not true. I don't think the Aztec culture had much to bring to the table, as opposed to the Spaniards who conquered them. We've all seen that meme, hopefully, of the dude ripping the heart out of the corpse and saying, "Oh, look, the far right," as the conquistadors approach. Like, the Aztecs didn't really have much to bring to the table there. They're an evil culture, and the world is better off without that culture existing. And the same could be said of a lot of cultures like the Caribs and stuff like that. So multiculturalism as a premise, or should also be rejected, because first of all, this is America's culture. This is America. We should celebrate our own culture also above the culture of other nations, because this is America. And it's not wrong to celebrate your own culture. And again, not all cultures are equal, because not all cultures have the same values, and not all values are equal. Obviously, we as Christians should know this. So there's a huge multiculturalism premise undergirding. I don't know if Josh Bice is making the connection here, but again, multiculturalism is how it was one of the buzzwords that led us to wokeness. But as you'll see, he uses James Lindsay tactics in this article to argue that we're the ones employing woke tactics, even though he just implicitly employed and invoked multiculturalism as a good thing. Any last words before I move on?
I don't know.
In a similar way, Encyclopedia Britannica provides the following definition: nationalism is an ideology that emphasizes loyal devotion or allegiance to a nation or nation state and holds that such obligations outweigh other individual or group interest.
I mean, I guess just repeat back the prior conversation. Would you want to have a leader, an ambassador of your people who is not a nationalist by
Yeah,
that
do you
definition?
want a globalist?
You want someone that's going to put other people's nations above your own nation, because that's the
Or
problem with American
better
form.
yet, themselves. They're there to enrich themselves. So and then within the current movement, we have a movement that uses a compound term. I gotta pause right there, because all nationalism is compound. It's always compound depending on what the nation is. Anyway, a compound term, Christian nationalism, that's being employed by all sorts of different groups, which will necessitate intentional differentiation and specificity of meaning. While it's good to support sovereign national identity, closed borders, and capitalism, that's not exactly how the terms function within the framework of Christian nationalism.
I mean, it's certainly a platform. It's certainly on the platform. But even still, again, advocating closed borders, and we're talking, possibly down to zero immigration or near zero immigration. So yeah, I mean, it's on the platform.
Yeah, I mean, there is cultural interest in closed borders and stuff like that, and especially since the whole point of the open borders is to demographically terraform America, you know, using replacement theory and stuff like that, which is what they've successfully done in much of the UK. which is why, you look at the city of London, it's very much not Britain anymore. So, what is Christian nationalism? This is where the article starts to actually pick up and get a little bit more relevant. Uh, in many ways, it's a complicated question. It's like asking, what does it mean to be Presbyterian? Do you mean PCA, PCUSA, OPC, or other versions such as CREC? To be clear, there are various versions of Christian nationalism being offered up within both political and evangelical circles. It's possible to be a Christian who is proud of your nation in a patriotic way, and yet not fall into the category of Christian nationalist. I actually will agree with that, because there are many Christians out there that don't believe that the government should even enforce the second table of the law. Yeah, you can love your country, you can even vote properly and stuff like that, but if you don't have an end game of enforcing the second table, let alone the first table of the law, then yeah, you're not exactly a Christian nationalist. Any comment on that?
No, no. I mean, refer back to patriotism and the weaknesses of patriotism versus nationalism.
With this conversation, we have various terms that are being connected to Christian nationalism, either by necessity of the relationship or by way of an alternative title altogether. Some of the key language includes conservative patriotism, white Christian nationalism, conservative political nationalism, political Protestantism, Christian nationalism, mere Christendom. That last one's a Doug Wilson term. Doug
I mean,
Wilson's trying to popularize mere Christendom. I think that's a losing endeavor, but let's maybe focus group some of these terms. I think Christian nationalist is the best term here.
conservative.
And the second best would be
I
political
mean,
Protestantism, my
conservative
opinion.
patriotism means nothing because again, it goes back to what is a conservative. So, and I've never even
Same with
seen.
conservative political nationalism. That means nothing either.
Yeah, those two terms I've never even seen them before, so I don't know who's using them.
Political Protestantism, I'm sure, is someone's idea. That one's a little bit better. Mere Christendom is what Doug Wilson's trying to popularize, but it's kind of like the movie. You've seen the Founder movie with who's the lead
Ray
actor?
Kroc or
Michael
Keaton.
Michael Keaton. Yeah. So Founder movie with Michael Keaton. At the end of the movie, this is Ray Kroc of the story of McDonald's, goes to the McDonald's brothers and says, you can't, we bought the name and all. And he's explaining to the McDonald's brothers why their own product was successful, because he surmised that, they didn't just there's no way they just gave him the tour of how their operation works. So they've probably given all these people tours of how the McDonald's store works, how the fast food chain worked, or not a chain at the time. But no one was ever able to make it work because the name was critical to the success of McDonald's. McDonald's was a good name, and that's what Ray Kroc says in the movie, or Michael Keaton playing Ray Kroc says in the movie. And Christian nationalism is a much better name that people can get behind. Not mere Christendom. I like the term, but it's not a name people can get behind. We need the complete normies to get on board.
I mean, again, if you're going to be
Politically
very,
casual.
if you were going to be very like, well, I guess the opposite of disingenuous, if you're actually going to be like genuine with your adjacent titles, I mean, you might have chosen like, I guess, MAGA or some form of MAGA / America First. You might have chosen paleoconservatism.
Yeah. In fact, the most interchangeable term, I think, with Christian nationalism in a politics space is America First, because there's so much overlap between the two camps in the Republican Party. Now, electorally speaking, I don't think the Christian nationalist camp has been all that successful, but I don't think that there's no hope to improve that in the future. I think America First has been a lot more successful, but again, people like candidates like Carrie Lake, at the end of the day, I don't think she was that great of a candidate in retrospect, and she couldn't win cleanly. She lost dirtily. So I think Christian nationalism is a term that people who are politically casual can get behind. I think it's, not theologically eggheaded, so to speak. It's not an ivory tower term. It's a more everyday term that, salt of the earth Americans can get behind if they're both Christian and believe in a national interest. So I think terms are important. And that's why, I had a debate with this on Berean Babe's channel last Saturday. And the point that I brought up was, and I made this point that mere Christendom is not a term that will sell.
And again, Christian patriotism. I mean, you're going to
That
run
won't
it.
sell either. That
You're going to
how
run it.
how how many times have neocons used that?
I mean, if you just swap the words, not even the ideology, you're going to end up in the same exact situation, and with these people writing their articles against it. So even if you change the name to Christian patriotism, you're just wheel spinning.
And TD says Christ. He put an extra thing to recognize the typo there. Christ is kingism, and I like that. So, why doesn't he like Carrie Lake?
She is a little socially liberal. That's, I mean,
yeah, she's very socially liberal. I kind of think that a lot of her, jive is an act.
and let's just be honest. I think if she were, I think
there's a reason why she was going to drag shows several years ago. And I don't think she's evolved much on the issue, and she's doing photo ops with Bruce Jenner and all. So,
well, I mean, I also think, not to say being a woman hurts her, but let's just be honest, especially since she's a little bit more on the crass side, that also hurts her. Versus a man can be a little bit more Trumpian in that regard. So,
well, she didn't win, and she's sticking around, and people actually think that she's vice presidential material for Trump, which is a laughable proposition, but I digress. Continuing with the article, for instance, more than 5,000 people assembled in Pennsylvania for the Reawaken America tour back in late 2022, where Donald Trump addressed concerned attendees regarding the direction of the nation. The central feminist, sorry, I was reading a chat for a second. The central message of the event was focused on a reaction to the woke leftist politics and agenda being pressed upon our country. We face a battle in our country, said retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor turned election denier, told the crowd. We're like, really? Did Josh Bice really have to add election denier?
and you just, lost my respect right there. I mean,
like, is that a necessary detail that's germane to the article, especially since this is a 2022 rally? Like, this is one of my criticisms of G3, by the way. They suck at politics. They might be great on church issues. By all accounts, they are. But they suck at politics. They don't understand politics. This is a comment on the Carrie Lake thing. You have an imbibed feminist ideology to a great extent to run for governor as a woman. Yes. I think that is true. I think that's largely inescapable in our for a lot of people in our culture, but yeah. And continuing with the Mike Flynn quote, I mean, Christianity is under attack. Honestly, it feels like everything is under attack. After Donald Trump spoke, more than 100 people lined up to be baptized. The movement using the term Christian nationalism to describe their cause and Christian baptism as a sign. I don't get the point of that paragraph. Other than to virtue signal about the election. Now, there is some legitimate grievance in this paragraph. As you continue to survey the political landscape, you can find Christian nationalism appearing on t-shirts that proclaim proud Christian nationalists sold by Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Samuel Perry, an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma and the co-author of the book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, makes a claim that white Christian nationalism is rapidly is growing rapidly within the Republican Party. While we continue to see Christian nationalism appearing in the sphere of politics, that's not exactly the version being discussed within evangelicalism. You want to tackle that one first? Marjorie Taylor Greene,
I
who I think is
mean,
also the embodiment of this.
again, the problem with Marjorie Taylor Greene is she's a firebrand, not an intellectual, and
I think she's actually pretty dumb.
Yeah.
I don't respect her intelligence. And she's the the horseshoe theory of practical intelligence, that meme. She's the low IQ that
Yeah,
comes to the right conclusions.
but
That's who Marjorie Taylor Greene is. Stephen Wolf would be on the other side of that. Joe Webben, I think, would be on the other side of that. Doug Wilson. Did I already say him? He's a smart dude. I think he's sometimes a little too smart for his own good. But
Lauren Boebert would be on the
yes,
Marjorie
she's
Taylor
also
Greene
on the
side.
unintelligent as it relates to anything faith related side. But and then he goes on to give credence to Samuel Perry, who's that dude that was on and that segment that NBC did on Doug Wilson. The segment that they did on Doug Wilson. Samuel Perry was a part of that segment, and I get that. I like MTG. My goodness, you're losing me. Look,
I'm not saying I don't like her. She is
when she talks about faith, it's cringe. And
yes.
She also viciously backed what's his face, Kevin McCarthy.
And let me just
I don't know how you justify that move either, but politically, I think she comes to the right conclusions. I just don't think she's very smart. She doesn't know how to articulate any issue related to theology.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. We need firebrands and intellectuals. She's a firebrand. That's her lane.
Yeah, I agree she has a place. But her trying to market Christian nationalism, I do agree, is cringe. And she has a book coming out on it or something. And it's like, and Stephen Wolf is discussing, how do I capitalize off her trying to sell a book about Christian nationalism, offer up the real thing. At the same time, the gold standard definition, hold on, it's there. Yeah. At the same time, the gold standard definition of this movement within evangelicalism is by Stephen Wolf in his book, A Case for Christian Nationalism. However, prior to the release of his book, Andrew Torba and Andrew Eisker released a much shorter book titled Christian Nationalism, A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion and Discipling a Nation. Andrew Torba is the founder and CEO of Gab.com. Andrew Eisker is the pastor of 4th Street Evangelical Church in Waseca, Minnesota. He is a graduate of Minnesota State University. Mankato and Greyfriars Hall Ministerial Training School in Moscow, Idaho. And he has several churches in Missouri. And he has served several churches in Missouri, West Virginia, and Minnesota. The description of their book provides the following statement regarding Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is a spiritual, political, and cultural movement comprised of Christians who are working to build a parallel Christian society grounded in a biblical worldview. This book is a guide for Christians to take dominion and disciple their families, churches, and all nations for the glory of Jesus Christ, our King. I do have issues with that definition because that definition includes the political, but it kind of neglects the political.
It does. I mean, again, I tore my book to shreds.
And yeah, I know you weren't a fan of it.
Yeah, I was not a fan of it. And yeah, pretty much how to build a parallel Christian society. Yes, Andrew Torba and Eisker, they both conflate Christian nationalism with the parallel economy. So they are pretty much one and the same as far as the book is concerned. And his premise is that Christian nationalism, or i.e. the parallel economy, would one day overtake the worldly economy. And therefore you have a Christian nation. So basically the worldly economy that controls its own money, has its own supply chains, that has a military, will one day collapse, and then the Christian economy will supplant it. That's kind of where he goes at it.
So it's not even a long march through the institutions kind of thing?
No, it's a build your own institutions, and one day they'll take over.
Yeah, I don't feel that as a premise. That's not how Rome was Christianized. moving on to the Bice article, Doug Wilson, pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, provides the following endorsement to Andrew Torba and Andrew Eisker's book. If you want to know more about Christian nationalism, this book is for you. You will be getting your info from the horse's mouth, as it were, instead of from the mainstream media, which is oriented more to the other end of the horse.
I
Doug
guarantee
Wilson has a good way with words.
I guarantee you he didn't read the book though. So again, this quote just to take a jab at Doug Wilson, I don't
Uh,
like if
TD
I
says at least a chapter on dispensationalism in Torba's book was on point. Was it?
I would have preferred more detail. I ripped that chapter for not having enough detail.
Oh.
Again, I mean the whole book I could do the same for, but that one in particular I did talk about how it's just like, okay, you're gonna talk about, oh, the Talmud says XYZ. Well, quote it, put it in there. But he kind of doesn't do that. And that's what I took issue with in his
Okay.
book.
Now, I thought that there was some beef between Andrew Torba and Doug Wilson on some level, but and Canon Press clearly did not publish the book because it was self-published. Fun fact about that book. So, yeah, Canon Press, I don't like how they do business. I don't think it's a biblical way that they do business in terms of book selection material.
I mean,
Because
again,
they don't take requests, or they don't take unsolicited requests or submissions.
well, the other thing with, again, having a Doug Wilson thing, again, I don't know why they're even going that route. I think it's kind of like you prejudice the jury kind of thing, because whatever people think of Doug Wilson is what they're going to think of Christian nationalism. But
Well, this is
or
what he's going to do, the prejudice to jury here. This next paragraph.
yeah,
Andrew Torba, the founder of Gab.com, has also come under intense heat for public statements that were perceived as anti-Semitic, including his stated desire to overcome Judeo-Bolshevik society, a term that makes the claim that communism is a Jewish plot. Uh, just a little side note on that, because that is, you're on the border between, based and Fed post when you talk like that. And the thing is, like, I believe Jews were more prevalent in the Menshevik movement in Soviet Russia rather than the Bolshevik movement. But it's not like you can't really deny that disproportionately speaking, it was still higher in the Bolshevik movement. But I think Jews actually historically preferred the Mensheviks, which were also bad. But Torba has also said conservative Jews and non-Christians are welcome to stay in his ideal society, going so far as to say about his following version of Christianity,
and this was the quote that
Christian
was.
nationalist movement. Yes, this part came under fire. What we're reading is not the original variation of this article. He edited it because he mischaracterized or misquoted what he said, because even this is still sloppily written. Because this is about Christian nationalism. The quote is, "We don't want people who are atheists. We don't want people who are Jewish. We don't want people who are, non-believers, agnostic, whatever. This is an explicitly Christian movement because this is an explicitly Christian country." So Andrew Torba says that, you have to be a Christian to be a Christian nationalist. That's a long-winded way to say you have to be a Christian to be a Christian nationalism. And then, needless to say, such statements have not been received well, which has opened the door for Wolf's book, which has gained a great deal of popularity. So he's basically saying Andrew Torba and Andrew Eisker had their chance to set the definition, but instead Stephen Wolf's definition has become the gold standard because of the heat that they took. I think that's kind of what he's saying. And that does kind of go in line with Virgil Walker's upcoming article, presumably, just based off, what I read in the first sentence. And I know Virgil Walker hates the term nationalism. Stephen Wolf's published his book, A Case for Christian Nationalism, in November of 2022. In his book, Wolf lays out several key points regarding Christian nationalism, including the following definition. Christian nationalism is a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. That is a very academic definition. I like it. I think that, my definition is slightly better because it's less egg-headed. But again, Stephen Wolf, really smart guy. It's definitely reflected in his definition. I don't see what's disagreeable about that definition. You've read the book. I'm sure you can flesh it out a little bit more.
I mean, I did like his definition. I mean, again, my problems with the book weren't his definitions. Um, Let me actually see because I wrote a review on that, so you can always check that out. But because it's a 478-page book, so just to give you a rundown, I said it was a comprehensive and well-rounded definition, encompasses what makes a nation, that laws and customs are definitive elements in a nation. So, and the other thing I liked about it is it doesn't Americanize the context of Christian nationalism, nor does it limit the scope to contemporary politics. So again, this
Yes.
is
So I watched the Stephen Wolf interview today, and he talked about, this is a movement that can be done in other parts of the world, which is what I captured in my definition, which we wrote about we discussed in the last video I did on this topic. And because I talk about Christianizing a nation, what he's talking about is a nation self-consciously saying we are imposing Christian values and Christian social customs, because Stephen Wolf has a large emphasis on a social fabric that binds us all together. That's kind of what I understand from him. And I guess people have issue with heavenly good, even though, again, I think there's heavenly good done, or that is the result of Christians in government pointing public policy to Christ. Now, it's not like it automatically saves people, but the argument that's being made from people at G3 and others is that cultural Christianity condemns people, which is highly unbiblical.
I mean, I know I forget the guy's name. I'd have to look it up real quick, but like John Harris had the interview with a guy talking about the idea of civic religion. So it's the idea that every country, every nation has a form of civic religion. I mean, just the fact that like America has Easter and Christmas as federal holidays would be pointing towards the heavenly good. So I mean, they're still recognizing or swearing the oath to the Constitution on the Bible for the inauguration. That's or public prayer in meetings. That's pointing towards the heavenly good.
Right. Jamie Starfish says none of these G3 guys were doing this until very recently. It's very strange what they're doing. I think they're just getting involved in a conversation. Although I do believe that they started the conversation, but they can't stop it. So they are confronting it because I think they're irrelevant if they don't.
Well,
That's
I mean,
just
I
my opinion.
think they understand that this is gaining traction, but again, so I think they're not just doing it out of the blue. Like they're not just doing some kind of like QAnon bashing. I think they're actually doing it because there's a material movement in this issue.
Yeah.
And they're out of the conversation.
Now I'm going to ask you this. One of the biggest criticisms against Stephen Wolf's book is that he explicitly says he's not going to be doing a bunch of exegesis on the text, and he's relying on historic reformed assumptions. What's your take on that?
I mean, yeah, that's like the quote that's probably one of the more taken out of context. Again, this article actually brings it up where he talks about he claims to build upon Francis Turretin and John Calvin. Obviously, others in that list would be Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. So he is building upon Christian tradition. Obviously, he would claim he's not a theologian, but a political scientist. And the other thing I'll point to is basically the premise, like he argues the theological premise of a nation.
I mean, the way I see it, he's very honest about who he is. And Stephen Wolf's very honest about who he is. So when he talks about politics and people, call him racist for it, which is what the G3 people largely did, uh, because they took it in a theological category, which wasn't correct. And when you talk about, okay, there's a context for it, I kind of understood that as well. And the
Well,
other thing that gets taken out of context, I think, is the quote where he talks about, "I'm not Baptist, so I'm not doing the work for you."
which I don't mind.
I
I
don't
don't
mind
mind
at
doing I don't
all.
mind doing that work for him. But I
It's
will
not
say,
for
like,
him; it's for
when
Baptists everywhere.
yes, but you when he says he's not doing a whole lot of the exegesis, I mean, obviously the first couple chapters set up a lot of the theological framework, then the rest of the book builds upon that framework. So one thing you have to understand is, and I'd be curious what the G3 people would say, is what would a pre-lapsarian world look like? And if they can't answer that question, then they really can't necessarily respond to a lot of the arguments that
All right, that's
Stephen
a
Wolf
big
is
word.
positing.
Can you define it for us?
Prelapsarian being pre-fall. So what would an unfallen man look like? What
And I
would
think,
an unfallen human civilization look like?
and Stephen Wolf was based off of, or he was basically taken out of context by James Lindsay, who accused him of Gnosticism for having an answer to these esoteric or needle dancing angel type of question, because that's what it is.
I mean, the Gnosticism thing was his rebuttal argument. So it wasn't even like his argument. That's him in the book responding to possible objections, particularly it's either first or second period, this world's not our home mentality. So that's the argument that he was responding to, and says that, yes, this world's not our home, i.e., the Gnosticism, because, the Bible says this world's not our home. We're citizens of a higher kingdom. So he's still saying you're pointed towards heavenly good, even while on the earth. I mean, again, the quote's taken out of context because it's also a response to an objection. But yes, but if you don't, but one of the arguments is that he would say government would exist in a pre-fallen world. That if that given enough human population, you would have some form of civil hierarchy. So therefore, civil hierarchy is good, or having music in a society is good, and would exist in a pre-lapsarian world. So therefore, music and the fine arts are good, or having, and he would extend that to nations existing, or different ethnos existing in a pre-lapsarian world. Again, he would extend that, or maybe not different languages, but he would say that people that would settle in one part of the earth in a pre-fallen world would be distinct in culture and customs from those in another part. So he says that these things, dare I say, cultural diversity is a good thing.
Wow, that's really racist. He's a white supremacist. Um, Moving on with back to the article. Now that we've painted a bigger picture of what Stephen Wolf articulates for people who haven't read the 400 and however many pages, while the moving on to the Bice article, while this is not a review of Wolf's book, that what he provides us is a print in print is a working definition for what he references as a pan-Protestant project. Perhaps one of the most controversial chapters of the book is found in the 7th chapter, where Wolf lays out his views regarding civil government and the great man that he calls the Christian prince. He claimed he claimed to build upon Francis Turretin and John Calvin, as he writes, the prince, unlike church ministers, is a mediator, a vicar of God in outward civil affairs. As Calvin said, civil rulers represent the person of God, whose substitute they in a manner act. For this reason, the prince is called a God in Scripture, referring to Psalm 82, verse 6. He has, as Calvin said, a sacred character and title. In a sense, we see God in the magistrate. These statements create more questions and growing concerns among those of us who hold a different view of a church and state relationship. Now, anywhere did that quote suggest that the church would run? The keys of the church would be mixed with the sword of the government, which is where he's going to go with this.
I mean, again, I thoroughly enjoyed the Christian Prince as a chapter in the book. I thought it was a very pleasant read. I mean, obviously the notion of Christian Prince got, you know, misconstrued because I mean I took it as very Machiavellian and like the idea of Machiavelli is the prince, so I thought it was that. Obviously, you know, the idea of a Christian Caesar. Um,
Sounds pretty
and
based.
well, and just to kind of read the footnote, like the quote in question is I'm not calling for a monarchical regime over every civil polity, and certainly not an autocracy. Uh, though I envision a measured and theocratic Caesarism, the prince would be a world shaker for our time who brings a Christian people to self consciousness and who, in his rise, restores the will for their good. The prince is a fitting title for a man of dignity and greatness of soul who will lead the people to liberty, virtue, and godliness to greatness. And then the footnote at the bottom of the page, which I think is very important, is contrary to uh, calumnies of G.K. Chesterton against Caesarism. Man, men trust a great man not because they distrust themselves, because social conditions deny their self trust as an outlet for noble action, and the great man offers a path to noble action, viz., a path out of ideological mediocrity, slavishness, and indignity. Caesarism is often defined as authoritarian or autocratic by those who see politics dualistically. Regimes are either democratic or authoritarian or dictatorial. I reject the framing and would point out that modern democracy is often more oppressive than its alternatives. I prefer Caesarism in our time because it emphasizes personality in civil rulers. So, I mean, I took this as him articulating the appeal of Trump,
I
and that,
thought of Trump too.
yes,
But
and
the problem is, my problem with Trump is that he doesn't live up to Julius Caesar. He's not our Julius Caesar, and he refuses to be.
but so Wolf's argument is mainly that it would take a Trumpian like figure to institute Christian nationalism. And
Caesarian figure.
Caesarian, yes. But but so that's where he's coming from.
Well,
And my criticisms of the chapter were not necessarily that the prince would be a spiritual leader, because I would say that all politicians are in some sense spiritual leaders. I mean, you see this in the is in Israel and Judah, where the kings were spiritual leaders, even though they didn't technically oversee the temple.
yep, there's a
You,
separate ecclesiastical government.
and again, you see this in COVID, where one man became pope and all the churches bent the knee. And that's actually where my criticisms come from. Is it would be good if the politicians were curtailing the church in its excess, which you might see with like a Tucker Carlson taking snap jabs at Beth Moore, Russell Moore, and other figures
Tim Keller.
in Tim Keller. So, you know, if you had a politician doing that, like Donald Trump saying Russell Moore's an awful person, to give you a example,
A throwback to 2016.
yeah, if you had your president of the United States saying that, that would curtail the worst excesses of the church. The
Yeah.
problem the problem I take with this chapter, or at least my criticism of it, is it generally would work the opposite direction, where the so-called prince is trying to interfere with the church, not the church rebuke, or which would require the church to offer rebuke, rather than the church being astray and the prince being the corrective force.
But in several ways, because we can look at Donald Trump as this kind of prince like figure, and he was sort of a corrective force in some ways for the church because he was a revealer. And a lot of people were exposed by Donald Trump. Like David French was exposed because of Donald Trump. Beth Moore was largely exposed because of Donald Trump. There's a lot of Beth Moore underlying problems. Russell Moore, a lot of underlying problems, but nonetheless exposed because of Donald Trump. So there is that. The problem is, I might actually be more inclined to agree with him, but the problem is, what who was that figure that established it for? Was it Alfred the Great? Was he the Christian ruler that established England as a Christian?
Yes, Alfred the Great would be like English common law really descends from him. Would he not have been a Christian prince in his day?
Right. But according to a lot of these objectors to Christian nationalism, cultural Christianity is bad and it hinders the advancement of the gospel. But you can point to Christian leaders like Alfred the Great or even Constantine to some degree, even though I
I
think his
he
salvation is a little bit more dubious.
Now Stephen Wolfe does not address Constantine in the book. I pointed out in my review of the book that it'd be like Constantine calling a Nicene council, and you're shepherding the church back to orthodoxy. The language that Wolfe uses in the book, he uses marriage as a metaphor because he's obviously, he actually is preaching, male headship in a marriage. That he says that the husband does not fulfill the duties of the wife, but he can offer rebuke if she is failing to do her duties. So he's not taking over her duties, but instead rebuking her or correcting her if she is derelict in her duties. That's how he frames it.
All right, I want to speed through this a little faster. A brief case against Christian nationalism is the next section. While I do fully embrace the once pejorative label of Christian, I would want to distance myself from any form of Christian nationalism proper. I am concerned with various hybrid approaches to Christianity, i.e., woke church or white Christian or black Christian, as examples of this confusion. The foundation for my position is based on the theological conclusions that I've come to embrace through a study of Scripture with application to our context. Allow me to explain some of my concerns and set forth some unanswered questions. My attempt is laying out my concerns as a stand for the gospel, for God's church, for the truth, for freedom, and that I would hope would not be viewed as intentionally divisive, obtuse, or public opposition against friends. Christians should pursue unity when possible, but I likewise believe it's possible to disagree on the issue of Christian nationalism without unnecessarily fracturing friendships. Those who hold, I do want to say I agree with that for a second. Those who hold the issue of Christian nationalism to a higher degree of essentials may press this to a necessary point of division, and in such cases, although it's not my intention, I would concur.
I mean, I think it should only be elevated to points of division when I guess when the opposite approach is antinomian in some
Right?
regards,
Yeah, I think that's a
meaning
fair way to say. But it's not a primary level issue, and he's right about that. Concerns regarding government overreach. I embrace the idea set forth in the first paragraph of the 1689 London Baptist Confession in Chapter 1 on the Holy Spirit regarding the sufficiency of Scripture for faith and life obedience to God, in Chapter 24 on the civil magistrate. The 1689 LBC in paragraph 1 says that God has armed them with the power of the sword for the defense and encouragement of them that do good and for the punishment of evildoers. Notice that there is nothing stated about the keys. It only references the sword. Therefore, conflating these two responsibilities would, in my estimation, be a contradiction of Scripture. We must remember that the writers of the 1689 LBC intentionally omit a paragraph contained in the Westminster Confession of Faith that dealt with the role of the magistrate in overseeing various powers to preserve order, peace, truth, worship, and discipline of the church. Our Baptist forefathers were aiming at religious liberty for the church rather than encouraging the civil magistrate to take hold of both the sword and the keys. I reject the integration of church and state at any formal level. I believe that these two spheres, to use a Kuyperian model of sphere sovereignty, is helpful to distinguish the differences between the sphere of the church and the sphere of the state. One is civil, the other is spiritual. One has been given the sword while the other has been given the keys. While there will be some overlap within both spheres, so specifically the church within a nation will be members of both spheres, there is a boundary that must be maintained. Just as a king and the priest had very different or distinct separation within the Old Testament Israel, I believe that the civil magistrate must never take up the keys of the church, nor should the church seek to wield the sword that's clearly given to the magistrate. What do you think on that?
I mean, if you're gonna, I mean, again, we did the article, the Can a Baptist be a Christian nationalist? And we talk explicitly about the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which, again, if you were to design a government based on the Christian, the civil, based on their doctrine of civil magistrate, it would be something that is very similar to Christian nationalism. Because again, the notion of religious liberty as we commonly understand it today is not what the people
It's
in
not biblical.
it's not the 1689 understanding of religious liberty. Religious liberty means if you want to be a Presbyterian, be a Presbyterian. It doesn't mean import a bunch of Muslims, settle them in Dearborn, Michigan, and that's religious liberty.
Now, this was the paragraph that set off all the red flags for this article. He is conflating integralism, which is a Roman papist doctrine on civil magistrate, with Christian nationalism, which is distinctly Protestant. And I say distinctly Protestant because no one's advocating for a pope. So when Scott and Neil, tweets about, and Josh Bice tweet about a Protestant pope, they're getting clowned because, first of all, Protestant pope still sounds better than Joe Biden. Second of all, no one's asking for that.
Well,
and then third of all, this is my clowning of them. People in John MacArthur's camp really shouldn't be accusing any other Protestants of wanting to erect a Protestant pope. That is some plank in your own, or log in your own eye.
Ironically, John MacArthur came under heat for talking about religious liberty.
Oh yeah.
So
he talked about religious liberty, isn't a biblical concept, and you're
right. And again, keep in mind, this is also the 1689 because he only read the first paragraph of chapter 24, which is it is lawful for a Christian to accept and execute the office of a magistrate when called thereunto, in management whereof, as they ought especially to maintain justice and peace, according to the wholesome laws of each kingdom and commonwealth. So again, the 1689 assumes that it is preferable for a Christian to be a ruler than a non-Christian.
All right, and here's a church history paragraph. Church history is replete with cases of religious establishment using force to bring about submission of the people. This was true during the Reformation when John Rogers was burned at the stake in 1555 under the reign of Queen Mary I, aka Bloody Mary. Wasn't she Catholic, or am I confusing the Mary that Maryland is named after with another Mary? This led to the burning of Oxford martyrs in the streets. During the days of the Puritans, such unbiblical pressures upon the illegal brand of Christianity opened the door for the great ejection and persecution. John Bunyan spent 12 long years in prison because of such governmental overreach. Therefore, I reject the argument made in a roundtable conversation by Tim Klein that since mankind is made up of body and soul, the role of the magistrate is to lead the people in the gates of eternal salvation. I would see this as a commission of God's church.
Again, I'd just refer back to
what are Christians to do in government.
Well, magistrates are inherently spiritual leaders, regardless. Saul was a spiritual leader. Yeah. And then he tried to usurp the priestly role as king, but he was still thought of as a spiritual leader to the Israelites, who said, "Look, we want a king like all the other nations."
When we study the founding of the earth, or founding of the United States of America, not the earth, we see the framers of the Constitution of the United States aiming at something different than what they had experienced in a negative sense in their motherland. That's why the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Therefore, over the last several years, it was right and good for the church to question the authority of the state to enforce lockdown rules and prevent the church from assembling to worship God during the COVID-19 controversy. If it was proper for pastors to speak directly to civil rulers and to call them to repentance, Why would Christians want to make the case that the government should have one hand on the sword and the other upon the keys? This is a straw man. That last part's a straw man. The part before that, again, G3 was nowhere on the COVID issue. They were nowhere to be found on the COVID issue.
It should also be noted that a Christian nationalist government would not have locked down churches.
But a Christian nationalist government acting upon Christian principles would not have locked down the country at all.
Or sponsored research in a foreign lab, if you want to really go that far.
Research.
Or
yeah.
Or done its entire pandemic response to the benefit of big pharmaceutical corporations, which is greed. So, I mean, yeah, if you really want to go, do you really think American, like, rejecting Christianity didn't have anything to do with our response?
He gets COVID? Worse. He gets worse because these are some modern examples he celebrates. I would adamantly oppose the view that Christians should shrink back from the public square and refuse to preach the gospel to everyone, including the civil authorities. John the Baptist spoke directly to Herod about the sin of adultery, and the pulpits today should not be silent regarding pagan leaders who openly sin and engage in legislating through a pagan lens. We see instances of other men doing this historically, including some modern examples, such as John Piper calling out the President of the United States, and John MacArthur calling out the Governor Gavin Newsom for the sin of supporting and legislating the slaughter of babies. Both Piper and MacArthur would reject postmillennialism and Christian nationalism. Again, John Piper is a terrible example to point to on the issue of Christians engaging in the public sphere. John Piper, in the 2020 election cycle, wrote an article basically saying it's okay to vote Democrat. Is he really a positive example to cite here?
And keep in mind, are both these examples after Biden?
Both of the, I don't know. I don't care about the John Piper one. You're not a serious person if you're looking at John Piper as an example of how Christians should operate in the public sphere.
Because I think not a serious person. The MacArthur one's from last year, I think. So yes. It's not even.
I wrote that article.
It's not even like you're going back 5 years.
And that's the other thing. John MacArthur has only been good in the public sphere since 2020. Late July 2020, John MacArthur realized that the theology he had taught for, 50 other years of ministry was wrong because it didn't compute when it related to the COVID government lockdowns. So John MacArthur was wrong on this issue for decades.
Well, and again, maybe just as an appeal to common ground with G3. So he says we should condemn the government for legislating in a pagan lens. So does that mean he would praise if we were legislating in a Christian lens? That we were legislating Christian morality?
That would naturally follow.
Forget first table stuff. How
about even just the second table? Can we at least agree on that?
Would, outlawing abortion or with penalties, would banning pornography, would things like that be praised by G3? Because that would be called Christian nationalism.
And I tweet that all the time. I was like, Christian nationalist W when Florida wants to execute child rapist. So they would reject postmillennialism. You know who else rejects postmillennialism? Stephen Wolfe. William Wolfe. Bodie. I'm not post-millennial. Bodie Baucham. Okay. John MacArthur's, pre-mill leaky Dispy, which I think is the least. I think post-millennialism is down there as far as biblical evidence goes, but it's above dispensationalism. Therefore, I wholeheartedly disagree with those who claim that a rejection of Christian nationalism will result in pietism, where Christians hide beneath church pews while praying incessantly, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus." The charge of shrinking back in fear of addressing sin in the public square is simply inaccurate and uncharitable. I think his whole characterization of Christian nationalism being integralism is inaccurate and uncharitable. But all right, let's wrap this up. The danger of nominal Christianity. As a Baptist, in the vein of the Reformation, Reformed Baptist, I embrace 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, and I baptize believers as they profess faith in Jesus Christ as Lord. Therefore, any attempt to baptize the nations by forcing people by magisterial rule to embrace the label of Christian would be an overreach of governmental authority. This error can find a direct connection to the theological error of paedo-baptism. As a Baptist, there is an obvious disconnect at this point, which is precisely why Stephen Wolfe said, since I'm not credo, okay, we already talked about this point. Yeah, this is a ridiculous argument.
I mean, I have a written response for this coming up as far as the paedo-baptism, credo-baptism argument. Again,
Right.
I don't think it's a good argument, but obviously Stephen Wolfe's a Presbyterian. He's going to assume Presbyterian arguments. He's not going to reconcile our theology for us. In fact, it's probably better that Baptists reconcile their theology. But
yeah, and there's nothing about the magistrate forcing people to accept the Christian label. Thus, I believe Christian nationalism leads to the spread of nominal Christianity, which is a cancerous condition that is both dangerous to individual citizens, providing them with false eternal security, and threatens the whole of civilization under big government rule. Which, again,
I mean, keep in mind,
we're already under that.
One of the chapters in Stephen Wolfe's book is a rebuke of Russell Moore celebrating the decline of cultural Christianity. So that's
right.
You're echoing Russell Moore.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go to his questions, and you'll see some James Lindsay influencing these. He's pulling the strings here, I think. Number one, is Christian nationalism, as defined in this article, compatible within the framework of the 1689 London Baptist Confession? Can a person be a Baptist historically and embrace this view of the church and state relationships? Short answer, yes. We already covered this in a previous video.
Let me raise the question. Since the 1689 is Sabbatarian, and unlike MacArthur's view on the Sabbath, they're a lot more stringent. Would a society of 1689 Baptist have blue laws or otherwise restrict certain activities on Sunday? Would they be doing NFL Sunday ticket? Probably not.
Will the empowerment of a Christian prince and the punishment of sinners encroach upon Jesus's blueprint of church discipline found in Matthew 18? I think the answer is still no. There's sin issues that aren't crime issues.
I mean,
you're not going to go to jail for being fat.
I mean, one thing I do say is it is technically, I mean, there's no verse that says that the state cannot punish heretics. In fact, the Bible would prescribe that heretics be put to death, particularly those that are false prophets. So if it is technically lawful under the Mosaic law, then it is certainly lawful under a Romans 13 understanding. Especially since, someone making a false prophecy could actually
they would get burned at the stake, right?
I don't know, but they would endanger the social order technically.
I believe in medieval times, Christians get beheaded, but pagans get burned. If a Christian prince, this is question 3, is empowered, what will happen to the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America? As a citizen of the United States and Christian living in this nation, I believe this is a valid question. Well, how did the Constitution interact with the first 40, 50 years of the America's existence, where they had state-sponsored churches?
Also, you're valuing the First Amendment over what Scripture would say. Again, if you had to use the 1689 that he supposedly embraces to form your political ideology,
you wouldn't be asking this question.
Yes. And again, you would have a very MacArthur-esque quote on what is religious liberty.
Yeah, I think you just juked him there.
I'm going to MacArthur card you.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's very fitting for G3. This is question 4. Could there be a concerted effort within the shadows of the political sphere that are manipulating a reaction within the Christian community to the woke agenda in order to bring about the specific change in relationship between church and state that could actually be weaponized against the church? This is a James Lindsay question, because what's interesting is that the objections to that Stephen Wolfe tweet about white evangelicals being the bulwark of society, or moral bulwark against insanity in America, the point about that is that, demographics and critical mass. That's the point that he was making. But he was called racist for that because there are no, race is an invented concept, which is actually what woke people believe. Woke people believe that race was an invented concept by white slave traders to justify slavery, when in reality, race, as typically used, has always really been interchangeable with the notion of ethnicity, which is a biblical concept. So
I mean, yeah, it might
they're the
vary
ones,
by
yeah.
it might vary by society.
So
Like
Christian
if you're in
nationalists don't,
China, if you're in China, if you're a Japanese person, you're a different race
yeah,
in their eyes. But and just to let's just really address this point. Are there not already concerted efforts in the shadows of the political sphere to manipulate the Christian community? We've seen this with the dark money, the George Soros money that was pretty much a premise of enemies within the church. That entire documentary is a follow the money trail, which that was what I found the most shocking. Then you have the Good Neighbor Initiative, right, with Russell Moore taking government money to peddle the vaccines.
yes,
So
that was also Facebook money. That wasn't, yeah, Zuckerberg.
you
So
have
yeah,
the FBI infiltrating
yeah.
Catholic churches.
And apparently Brandon, or is it Brian Auten, who's the coiner of the term evangelical dark web. He's the one that first used the term evangelical dark web, by the way. That's a fun fact. And he's apparently a Fed, which is a shock to very few people who know who that
So we're
is.
going to pretend that the church is not being infiltrated or subverted by this godless government that we currently have
Yes,
already.
the pagan government will persecute the church. A Christian government will inevitably uh, persecute the pagans. That's how Rome was Christianized. That's how Europe was largely Christianized. Uh, are there parallels between methodologies of Christian nationalism and CRTI that introduce ethnocentrism? I think no. We just acknowledge that race is a thing. And I think we're just tired of acting like, it's basically, it's okay to be white. You remember that slogan from like 2017? It's okay to be white. I think that's what even, a lot of Christian nationalists kind of emphasize or empathize with. Uh, the it's okay to be white. That's basically it. And that they don't like that. They don't like Stephen Wolf talking about white evangelicals as a voting bloc. They don't like that.
Well, I mean, I know Virgil Walker, like on
He took
Whitlock, was
major
talking
issue
about,
with that.
yes, but he's like, oh, white people will be in the minority. Yeah, that's not a good thing for America.
You know what's
Like the,
probably true is that white people are currently in the minority of believers, probably. The global South. That's certainly true in most denominations. That's a James Lindsay question, by the way. Do the goals of Christian nationalism fit within the ethos of the New Testament Christianity? In other words, if John Bunyan had been in Christian nationalism, a Christian nationalist, will we still have the Pilgrim's Progress?
I mean,
I,
if John
I,
Bunyan were alive today, he would be called a Christian nationalist because his beliefs on what should and should not be law are so far
to the right of
based
us.
are so based that he would be called a Christian nationalist because again, the things we believe now, the things that are internalized now are so beyond what anyone in majority of history or majority of Christian history would have ever thought. I mean he would think women voting is probably insane.
Yeah, Charles says I like the term ethnicity is more appropriate and accurate term. I think you're right. I'm just saying historically the terms have been used pretty much the same way.
Well, ethnicity is clearly defined. I mean, race can mean something different in the
Yeah, I
context.
think race is the word that's changed more in its denotation.
And again,
Especially in American context where race is more about skin color, but race in America used to be more about ethnicity. When you're talking about Italian immigrants, Polish immigrants, they had their own neighborhoods and cities and stuff like that. Irish, like it was more of a thing back then. But
and refer to
now, white is white, and then
and refer to Joel Webbin on any Pilgrim's Progress
yeah,
questions.
he loves that. So I imagine he would probably identify with because John Bunyan was Baptist, right? Reformed Baptist. That's my impression. When it comes to, that's not a James Lindsay question, by the way. When it comes to ordering a Christian nation under the banner of Christian nationalism, what version of Christianity will be enforced? In other words, will be a minimalist approach to embracing the Apostles' Creed or something more robust? Who makes this decision, and what creeds is the law of the land? And I think we are, the movement's trying to form the answers to those
I mean,
questions.
he even answers his own question with the Apostles' Creed.
That's a good starting place. Ecumenical Christianity. And this is where he says the church has been commissioned by Jesus to go and preach the gospel. We are engaged the common public sphere by delivering the good news of and supporting efforts to pass biblical legislation, which will lead to an orderly society and the glory of God. And or as Christians, we labor in the fields with the seed of the gospel, sowing and watering, but only God can give the increase. And the human heart will not be changed by civil legislation. That is not the realm of the civil magistrate. It's the realm of the sovereign God, who has the authority to call dead sinners to life by summoning them out of darkness into his marvelous light. And I would agree with every word of that. The problem is he's conflating Christian nationalism with integralism, and thus saying we're using civil legislation to change people's hearts. And it's like we're rather just pointing them to what Christian standards are. That we
Well,
have these
I
standards
don't
as Christians, and we're going to hold them to the rest of society. We're going to legislate our morality.
but I don't understand how that is consistent with his statement on nominal Christianity, because that's basically the foundations of what created so-called nominal Christianity.
Right.
Again,
So
if the person that wrote that paragraph would sit down with so-called Christian nationalists, they would probably agree on 90% of what they would want to accomplish if they were to write out a platform.
so I think we can move on to the Gospel Coalition article. Like, I did not think that this was an honest critique of Christian nationalism, because it conflates Christian nationalism with uh, uh, the integralism. So this is the Gospel Coalition, the good, bad, and ugly of Christian nationalism. We're going to go through this a lot faster. Patrick Schreiner this is the author, and the subtitle is A Baptist Perspective. What is Christian nationalism? Maybe this is a tired question, and maybe you're weary of reading about the topic. I'm going to zoom in a lot. But in some ways, our perspective on this issue is clearer now than it was in the weeks and months and years since the phrase came into the national spotlight. The dust has somewhat settled, and the time for the hot takes has ended. No, it has not. Christian nationalism has become a junk box into which everyone piles his own conceptions, but it is not monolithic. Three dominant perspectives on Christian nationalism have arisen over the past several years. Some equate Christian nationalism with rioting at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Others say it's an attempt to enforce God's law in the country. Others claim it's advocating for Christian values on issues such as abortion. How you view the movement depends almost entirely on your circles. To
But
maintain,
can we just say that points 2 and 3 were the exact same? But again, I guess the question is, would they agree with enforcing God's law in the country or Christian values on abortion? I don't. This is the Gospel Coalition. And second of all, they have no right to be talking about hot takes after the year they've had
this
with
year,
with
year to
the
date.
yeah. They have no right to be talking about. Now's not the time for hot takes.
Yes. Now is always the time for hot takes, is how I view social media. To maintain the unity and established by the church spirit, Christians must ask what a person means by a phrase before we jump to judgment. We want to be quick to listen and slow to speak. We should hear out three different forms of Christian nationalism as we evaluate each one. Although different, Christian traditions view the church-state relationship dissimilarly. My analysis comes from a Baptist perspective. Baptists have long advocated for religious freedom and separation of church and state. Baptists have been wary of theonomy, but have supported governments instituted by God while engaging in political dissent as needed. Just got to do a point of order and saying Baptists have long advocated for religious freedom of Christian practice and the separation of church and state. Also, because Baptists believe in congregationalism, that the local church, local autonomous church, is the highest ecclesiastical authority. That is the Baptist view on ecclesiology. So that's important to point out why Baptists believe in a separation of church and state, because they believe in the power of the local church.
Is this guy even reformed?
Is he even reformed, bro? I don't know. The good influence of Christianity in America and civil life. I think he's going backwards from the 3 points that he made. For some, Christian nationalism simply means that Christianity has influenced and should continue to influence the nation. They argue that America was founded on transcendent Christian principles. The Declaration of Independence affirms all men are created equal and are endowed by their creators certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Such a principle is worthy of Christian advocacy alongside a biblical view of issues like marriage, sexuality, and abortion. Our nation would be improved by affirming the goodness of natural law principles. In the best sense, this form of Christian nationalism doesn't attempt to dominate the political process or make the nation completely Christian, but seeks instead to bring change by persuasion. Rather than trying to overthrow the government, adherents advocate their cause by supporting laws, electing candidates, podcasting, writing, and developing think tanks. They won't enforce their opinions, but they won't back down from arguing them for them. Like, what even is this? Is he
when has the Gospel Coalition ever advocated Christianizing, like Christian morality in the law?
I mean, I'm
Like,
sure it's happened in a nominal
but they
sense.
generally subvert such efforts.
Yeah, generally.
Like,
you go.
no, generally, like just even the idea of should, I mean, I'll use their term, sexual minorities have legal protection under the law. Well, if you read your Bible, the answer is no. But would Gospel Coalition say, well, they have to be granted their rights too?
They wrote an article about that.
Because obviously Christianity today has already crossed that bridge.
Oh, yeah. So moving on, religion will always have a place in politics. Everyone has a religion she promotes.
Gotta love that female pronoun.
Yeah, you threw in a female pronoun that just seemed odd. The best form of Christian nationalism advocates for Christian principles, just like secular nationalism advocates for secular principles. If a Christian who is someone who believes that as a citizen our views should influence our nation, then surely every Christian falls under the label. But this isn't what most people mean by Christian nationalism. So you're calling the good, but you're saying it's not really good. The bad, fusion of Christianity and American civil life. I probably like where this is going. Not and I mean that ironically. Some view Christian nationalism as a fusion of Christianity with American civil life. Although this might not sound different from above, I don't think it's different. A fusion of Christianity and American life should coalesce. The political process should be overhauled to serve God. The laws of the United States should be explicitly Christian. The fusion view is flawed in at least three ways. First, it contradicts the Christian philosophy of witness. Okay, we're going to read this whole paragraph, then we're going to discuss. Christ's kingdom is to be advocated by persuasion, not power. Conversion must be a free choice, not instituted by command, compelled by the Spirit rather than instituted by human law. According to John in Revelation, Christians follow Christ in his victory primarily by witnessing to the reign of Christ, not by enacting laws. We follow a politic of persuasion all the way down. Revelation 12:20 says that we conquer the word, or conquer by the word of our testimony. We imitate Christ's victory through suffering. This is our main political witness. We conquer not by fighting the culture war, but by embodying Jesus' cross-shaped victory. His blood declares him the king of the universe, but our blood speaks to our solidarity with him. We continue to speak of and demonstrate Jesus' cross in our own lives, and so remain faithful in a pagan society. I hate everything about this paragraph.
I mean, this is you got to go back to the first century. The church is at its greatest when it's suffering.
That's again, we didn't Christianize Rome by martyrdom all the way through multiple centuries. There were some bad years, don't get me wrong, but a switch got flipped and the sword of the government was instrumental in the Christianizing of Rome and Europe. You can't deny that. That's just historically asinine.
I mean, if you want to talk about persuasion, not power, I mean, there's the Al Capone quote.
Well,
You can get a lot done with you can get a lot more done with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word. So, but at the same time, if you're willing to punish evil, then that means you're attaching social stigma, which would then be persuasion.
well, the one thing I need to point out is this guy even reformed? Is the gospel really spread? Do people become saved by persuasion? No, they become saved by the Holy Spirit. They become saved by the doctrine of election. Like, this is supposed to be a reformed, like, Gospel Coalition is theoretically supposed to be reformed, but they're acting like we're trying to sell Christianity, that we can persuade Christianity. It's,
He's also taking on a non-Reformed Baptist tradition to make his entire argument. But
yes.
this would
So
be
he's making a very Arminian argument about the nature of salvation.
But at the same time, is the government punishing evil with the sword, as is prescribed in Romans 13? Is that not persuasive?
Yes.
Is Josiah?
It says if you do this, you will be punished. If you sin, you will be punished.
Is Josiah killing the idol worship not persuasive? Is Elijah killing all the prophets of Baal? Is that not persuasive? Maybe not for the prophets, but certainly for the bystanders.
And I agree with this. God ordains both means and the end. Persuasion isn't necessarily Arminian. And that's kind of the point that I'm making, is that this is not an either or. This is an whatever God ordains.
I mean,
because when you start saying that persuasion is the only way that people come to faith, I'm not, I think people come to faith, through the supernatural intervention of the Holy Spirit. We might view it as persuasion, but I'm sure there's been several believers in Christian history that came because Christianity was a social norm enforced by the sword of government, and therefore they believed like small children. I think that's true for many believers in human history.
Well, keep in mind, I said he was Arminian for the paragraph before, which again, he's referring to more of an Arminian Baptist tradition, not a Reformed Baptist tradition, to make his argument. That's why I would say that's why it's Arminian. That's why the Arminian, because a lot of the Arminians didn't really develop the depth of political thought that the Reformed camp did.
Another thing to point out is that these people weren't willing to suffer an ounce for Jesus Christ when they locked down their churches in 2020. So that whole last part of this paragraph is completely invalid for anyone writing at the Gospel Coalition. You didn't want to suffer. You didn't want to risk fines, lawsuits, a cold. So don't, get out of here with that nonsense. You had your chance to suffer. You didn't want to.
Yeah, those Calvary Chapel Christian nationalists were willing to suffer.
Yes. Chuck Smith's denomination. The one they made a movie about. So second, the fusion view doesn't respect the temporal distinction between this age and the age to come. We live in the gap between Christ's resurrection and his second coming. In this time, religious freedom, diversity, and pluralism are blessings to God's people who wish to live in a peaceable and quiet life. In this age, we can't institute or codify God's law into authority. And that day will come, but it will be done by Christ himself, the true King. As citizens of the kingdom of God, we point forward to the kingdom, but never forget the age we inhabit. We live in the age of choice. Wow, he's not reformed. God has honored humans enough to give them time to repent. This doesn't mean neglecting the natural order God created for humanity's good, but it also doesn't mean seeking to establish the theocratic state. So religious pluralism is a blessing.
I mean, that's a David French argument.
That's very much a David French argument.
But
is Drag Queen Story Hour also one of the blessings we get to live under? That's a religious right. RITE. not
But I
the
mean, yeah, I mean, you're
political
basically
spectrum.
saying that it's a blessing of God's people that people can erect a mosque outside of it or across the street from a church, or that people can erect, synagogue down the street or a satanic temple. That's a blessing from God. It's really,
Really,
it's really
idolatry is
not.
a blessing from God.
It's a self fulfilling curse from man.
So this is a celebration of pluralism, which is in no way biblical.
Again,
This is a
find
biblically indefensible paragraph.
find the Bible verse that says, people have the inherent right to have idol worship.
Well, he uses 1 Timothy 2:2 for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. That's not related to the argument that he's making about religious pluralism being good. Third, this form of Christianity goes against key features of the American experiment, mainly pluralism and religious liberty. The First Amendment of the Constitution says Congress shall make no law with. Okay, we've already read that tonight. Although America does not have a distinctly Christian past, this form of Christian nationalism overlooks the pluralism and religious liberty for which many founding fathers advocated. Eliminating all dissent might sound attractive, but it would certainly allow governing authorities to get things done, and it would certainly allow governing authorities to get things done more quickly. But squashing dissent violates human liberty, equality, and the vision of the founding fathers. It requires coercion and conversion of and change from those who dissent. If it takes it to its logical conclusions, this nationalism undermines the foundation of free society. Should such a fusion dominate American civil life, it would divide the nation rather than unify it. Uniformity is in some aspects of the national life isn't all that bad, but we must always exist beside diversity. Is this guy a boomer?
I mean, again, I mean,
Like,
how
what
much
country is he living in?
how much time do you have to
How much
articulate
time do we
the
have?
beliefs of the founding fathers pertaining to religious liberty? Because we do tend to take out James Madison, perhaps Thomas Jefferson with the separation of church and state comment, and perhaps even Roger Williams as kind of like, oh, the religious liberty for all people, which I don't think Jefferson. I think Jefferson's context was mainly that he believed that the states had that right. Like he was going to say, yeah, we're not going to have the federal government impose
Congress
sectarian.
doesn't have the right.
Yeah, we're not going to have the sectarian disputes engaged by the federal government. Was more the Jeffersonian
Yeah, I
position.
mean, it's technically not against the First Amendment that the states set up local church denominations. That technically would not be against the First Amendment in its plain reading.
But if you notice, he actually makes a distinct claim that America was not really does not. Oh, he kind of undermines the whole America has a Christian heritage. Like I guess I would like he doesn't really flesh out what he thinks America's
What was so
Christian heritage is.
pluralistic about America at its founding? You had regional differences, but what was pluralistic about it?
I mean, like Massachusetts was very congregational. Obviously, the Virginia was more Anglican. So I mean, a lot of the pluralistic was regionalized. So one state was one way, and another state was a different way. But again, they had their own established practices codified.
Right. And the state of Maryland did not allow, free religious practice for non-Christian beliefs. And it was a Catholic colony. So, yeah, so what's the pluralism? Is it between, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Catholics? Because that's a significantly different pluralism than what we see now. And then the other thing is, I think the Constitution's dead.
Well, I guess yeah. Well, the other thing is you're appealing to the Constitution, not the Bible.
Yes.
The Constitution is not holy scripture.
Ray, would you agree that wokeness is a violation of the liberal understanding of separation of church and state? I think it is the imposition of a de facto religion. And I think, yes, I think that's right. But at the same time, we also shouldn't legally recognize wokeness as a religion like the IRS mistakenly did with Scientology. So I think it has all the elements of a religion, but we shouldn't respect it as such because that would be us elevating it. So then was that the third paragraph? Okay, that was. For all these reasons, this form of Christian nationalism is unbiblical, idealistic, and philosophically unsound. Yet this view remains bad and not ugly because we're trying to overthrow. We're not trying to. They're not trying to overthrow the government. Our critiques of the fusion view then should sound different than a rebuke of a darker form of Christian nationalism. Like, yeah, this article's cringe. The ugly dominion of Christianity over the American civil life. Christian nationalism can also turn ugly. It can become a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity with the civil life and does so by dominion. This type of Christian nationalism was exhibited by some on January 6th.
Like
This
the
is,
FBI.
yeah, apparently. This is the complete conflation of God and country and advocating for it by force or violence when deemed necessary. The critiques of Christian of the second position here apply here as well, but the phrase Christian nationalism is at its core a confusion of categories, although we can affirm that and even celebrate when the role Christianity has played in America as a nation. America can't ever be described as a Christian nation. No nation state can be described as a Christian nation state because Christianity doesn't work that way. Disagree?
I mean, I guess
I think this is the use of Christian as a word. How can we use Christian as a word? What are is the Gospel Coalition a Christian ministry?
no, because ministries
Well,
can't be Christian.
yeah, same logic. Families can't be Christian. Businesses can't be Christians. Seminaries can't be Christians. Colleges can't be Christian. Churches can't be Christian. What can be Christian? Oh, just the individual believer. Well, that's not how language works. And you're trying to do a Jesus juke here after hailing the U.S. Constitution as equal to the Bible in your argumentation. Another major critique I have of this article is that it only focuses on the American context of Christian nationalism, not trying to extrapolate an ideology that can be applied in various countries of differing cultures by Christians. As Lee Camp and I have suggested, Christianity and nation states are two vastly different entities. In terms of access, people enter Christianity by voluntary intention, faith, and baptism, but usually enter nation states by arbitrary historical accident, being born in the region. Geographically, Christianity is transformational and bound by no lines, but all nation states are defined by borders.
They don't believe in that.
They don't believe that at the Gospel Coalition. I also want to say, no, Christianity, in terms of access, people enter Christianity in large part by being born into Christian families. So, got to point that out because statistics, nation states defend their borders by using military might, not America, and building walls, but Christianity breaks down ethnic barriers and crosses borders to welcome all who repent and believe. Unlike nation states where citizens are largely monocultural, Christianity encourages diversity and multiformity. Nation states are interested in their own agendas, but Christians put others before themselves. Nation states see their own shortcomings as not lived up to their ideals and potential, but Christians recognize their shortcomings and stem from their corrupt nation. Again, that phrase about nation states isn't true. It actually seems to assent to the what's the term? Proposition nation theory, which Christian nationalism rejects the proposition nation. So let's just look at his table. This will save time. Okay. He made a table of the same thing he just said, basically. To claim America as a Christian nation confuses categories. If we wrong-headed try to enforce the fusion by force, Jesus explicitly said his kingdom is not of this world. If it were, his servants would fight. This is
Peter with the sword, I'm guessing.
He did tell him to get a sword. We advocate for the end of abortion, but we don't kill doctors who perform abortions. Well, shouldn't the government? That's the government's job.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not going to say it's a
The
sin.
government's job is to wield a sword, not the church.
I'm not going to say it's a sin to necessarily, mob wanting to go out and do
That's
something
what
to a
used
clinic.
to happen, and then they passed the
but-
FACE Act.
And again, that's
which was an anti-First Amendment law, an anti-biblical law. We can march and protest, but we don't form mobs of destruction. We work to elect candidates of integrity and conviction, but we don't harass public officials at town halls or school board meetings. Disagree with that.
Oh wow, that's a slap at
So we shouldn't be reading what they put in school libraries at public official meetings.
and that right there is why the Gospel Coalition is worthless on civic engagement.
Yes. When Jesus was arrested, his disciples asked him, "Shall we strike with a sword?" Then Peter struck the high priest's servant and cut off the right ear. But Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take up the sword will perish by the sword." No biblical view of the Christian political engagement can include violence as endorsed by the Dominion view. What is the Dominion view on violence? What's the Dominion view here? Like, there's an assumption made that January 6th was a violent event. Since when?
Well,
Because that's the only violence that he's pointed to.
well, what he's basically saying is there's no basis for a Christian to have forcible resistance to the government, i.e., Romans. If the
Doctrine
government
of
is
lesser magistrates.
yes, if the government is violating Romans 13, then the Christian has no violent recourse,
And then,
and that Christians can never rebel against the government. That's
well,
basically his argument.
has he ever heard of the Black Robe Regiment? Which I believe was Baptist, by the way.
Now, again, and just to point to Stephen Wolf's theory, because he has an entire chapter dedicated to the, I guess, what is a just rebellion, and he likens it to divorce, marital divorce, that while divorce is not preferable, there are circumstances where it is justified. And again, you see this in scripture. The 10 tribes were justified by God in rebelling against Rehoboam. And that was over taxes.
I want to read, yes, the Bible does justify the rebellion against Rehoboam, but it does also show that the rebellion of Rehoboam was not well founded or done for good motives, because they rejected the covenant that God offered them. That's what Rehoboam or the
Jeroboam
yes. did. I want to read Patrick Schreiner's bio listed here. Patrick Schreiner teaches New Testament at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. He is the author of several books, including Political Gospel, The Public Witness. I'm not going to read his titles, but do you catch the irony there? He teaches New Testament at Midwestern Seminary. New Testament. So his argument about Christian nationalism does not include a key New Testament passage, Romans 13.
Yeah, which again, if the government is in violation of Romans 13, then it does come to a point where Christians are justified in rebelling or resisting the government, even if it's by force.
Right. And, there's a lot of Protestant tradition on that.
And if you want to pick and choose your Thomas Jefferson quotes, then,
he goes further.
Yeah. He would say basically rebellion's necessary every generation with the blood of patriots.
Let's wrap this up. To speak of Christian nationalism is to open the door to disagreement. We must define what we mean by our terms. John Wesley is right to say that Christian nationalism has often been articulated in ways that pervert Christianity's message, but we should work to understand it when we condemn it, we should do so in precise terms. By using these categories for understanding Christian nationalism, by critiquing each one in its own terms, we can remain hopeful for change and clarity as we continue to discuss the relationship of Christianity to politics. Yeah, this article sucks.
Yeah, but you basically just say Christians shouldn't even go to their school board meetings and confront their politicians.
That's harassment or harassment. It's basically his argument. And again, not a whole lot of Bible verses that point to his the point of what is the purpose of a Christian government. Like Josh Bice's article was bad, but it at least was trying to engage on a higher level. This is just gutter level argumentation here. And this guy's a New Testament professor. And he doesn't realize that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, meaning from this world, but it's in this world. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, Jesus says in one of his first public messages.
I mean, presumably the
kingdom of heaven is here. The kingdom of God is here.
I would assume he's some form of Primo, just by his use of the Dominion, because that's like Dominionist views.
Generally a diss at post-mill.
Yes, it's generally like a derogatory use, insult against post-mill people. Which, I mean, there is distinctions between Dominionist and post-mill, because Dominionist is generally like your neo-apostolic Reformation types, with,
Yeah.
or like a Charlie Kirk, maybe, I think is might fall into that camp.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm not sure if we have enough time to do the.
I mean, it's a rehash. Virgil Walker is probably a rehash of the other
Right.
two.
Let's just read the first paragraph, and I think the first paragraph is actually a non-starter. This article is called "The Dangerous Intersection of Christian Nationalism." We'll read the first paragraph and maybe a key paragraph because he does kind of rehash a lot of the stuff we talked about tonight. The dangerous intersection of nationalism and ethnocentrism. If if what is meant by Christian nationalism today is a form of active patriotism, in which borders are protected, national sovereignty is enforced, and society moves back towards a Judeo-Christian ethic, call me a Christian nationalist. What's wrong with this sentence?
Now, what's the adjective that stands out?
Judeo-Christian? No, like Christian nationalists reject the idea of using the term Judeo-Christian. There is no Judeo-Christian. It's just Christian. The Old Testament, we believe in the Old Testament more than Jews do. And we have the New Testament. They have the Talmud instead of the New Testament. So our ethics, and this lines up in voting. You know, look at the voting patterns of white evangelicals versus Jews. It's not. We don't have the same values.
It's the inverse.
You look at how faithful, like how much the nation state of Israel believes in God. It's a stark amount of atheism there. But we're gonna talk about Judeo-Christian ethics, and it's like, no, you're not you're trying to, how do you do fellow Christian nationalists here, and it's not working. However, a few studies of the European nationalist movement, fewer however, few have studied the European nationalist movement. Fewer still understand that leaders of this new movement are giving it a makeover. This improvement is an attempt to rebuild something that was actually broken and required additional inspection. That's the first paragraph.
I mean, in general, trying to compare the European experience to the American experience is just, you're going to fall flat early on. But
right.
And the Brit, and just to even go further, like, since we're from the British tradition, like Britain and America, I mean, there's a difference between how the British colonies turned out and versus how the French and the Spanish colonies turned out.
Right.
I mean, like, obviously the former British colonies are remarkably more stable, more, I guess more Western, when you're looking at like Hong Kong, New Zealand, and Canada. I mean, so the worldview that undergirded British colonization and like a lot of the British tradition on Christianity that we inherited as a country is far different than that of German, French, Polish, or any of the other European countries.
So Wolf's statement raises several questions. Can nationalism be Christianized? Does Wolf's version of Christian nationalism lack the ethnic pride of previous attempts at nationalism? Does ethnocentrism comport with Christianity? Does the emphasis on Christianity purge its adherents of their sinful ethnic divisions through the unity we find in Christ? If Wolf's ambiguous language, i.e., his exchange of the word ethnicity for nation, is any indication, Christian nationalism is no different from nationalism in its basic form. Wolf writes, I use the term ethnicity and nation almost synonymously, though I use the former to emphasize the particular features that distinguish one people group from another. Nation is used to emphasize the unity of the whole, though no nation, properly speaking, is composed of two or more ethnicities. Emphasis mine. I take this as a political statement, not a theological statement. And the definition of nation is actually closer to ethnicity. the definition of state is more like America's not a nation. We're really more properly a state in political science terms.
Well, one thing that's, I mean, the nuance in Wolf's book is he doesn't exclude the possibility of assimilation. The example he gives in the book is a Cajun Asian, so to speak. So
What?
basically, yes, an Asian man who is Cajun, as in Louisiana, and he's pretty much born and bred a Cajun Asian. So he's assimilated as a member of that society in, La Bayou or whatever.
Now, did
And
not the Bible allow for assimilation into the tribe of Israel? And I think the
so
answer is in the long run, yes.
So there is room for assimilation under his worldview and his framework. But again, he would refer, and maybe this is a Thomism in him, he would refer back to a lot of Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers who basically articulated that affection for one's nation is natural to man. Now, Virgil disagrees with that.
Yes, if Wolf's vision proceeds and no nation, properly speaking, is composed of two or more ethnicities, what becomes of the multi-ethnic American experiment? Which ethnic group will be the lone bulwark? That's a reference to a tweet, to experience a privilege and participation in Wolf's Christian nation. And I just got to say, like, America would be, like, America is not recognized as an ethnic group, despite the fact that a lot of us are so uh, genetically heterozygous, or not homogenous, but hetero. I don't know what the word is, but from European ancestry. So America would become its own ethnicity and perhaps should be recognized as its own ethnicity in some part. Um, because, you look at a lot of Latin American countries, they're considered ethnic groups, but they have, look at Argentina. They have a rich history of European immigration in Argentina. Uh, again, Cubans, again, they're considered an ethnic, or they're actually considered a race in the US Census and all that. But it's like, America's been around longer in some, as a nation, as a country. So I just think it's weird. I, I think, given enough time, America would have developed its own distinction, ethnically speaking. I mean, your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's just a weird characterization of, I guess, Wolf's argument. I mean, obviously, again, there's a lot of things you could quote. I mean, and he's a little long-winded at times, but he would say that love of nation and love of people is natural to man. This goes back to the argument of, do you have more in common with the Nigerian Christian that's suffering persecution under Boko Haram, or do you have more in common with your secular neighbor?
Uh,
And
yeah.
a realistic answer is you probably have more in common with your secular neighbor, even though you don't share the same faith.
Right. And this next part gets into the whole argument about whether, who do you have more in common with, the Christian in Zambia or your not Christian neighbor down the street. And that's the part that he's getting into an argument. And Wolf would say you have more in common with your neighbor down the street than you do with the Christian in Zambia. And it's not in a spiritual sense in terms of final destination, but it's in a temporal stance and, who you are and what are your circumstances. So that's the part that I think he's getting at. And then after that section, he writes, Christian nationalism in many ways is a reactionary response to much of the resentment resulting from post George Floydian culture. CRT/I social justice and wokeism have aligned themselves along ethnic lines, forcing white people to choose between being an ally or being accused of racism. Neither embrace of critical race theory or intersectionality nor the Christian nationalist response is helpful to the peaceful coexistence of a multi-ethnic society. So this is a James Lindsay argument.
It's also a third way, it's kind of a third wayism. Oh, there's a third way.
I'm not necessarily in agreement with that, actually.
You don't think he's saying? Well, I mean, obviously he doesn't posit a third way.
But... Well, I think he's using no, because this is the response that's not embracing white power. Like Christian nationalist is replacing it is making sure that the white supremacist ideal is not actually the prevailing opposition to critical race theory. Because critical race theory, if you read Robin DiAngelo's book and believe it, the logical response as a white person is to be more racist. Like, why would I give up my power in institutions? I should be like Colonel Jessup and say, yes, I ordered the code red because it's in my it's in the interest of me, my children, my people group. Like that's the logical response of a white person reading White Fragility, is to realize that it's, white privilege. It is a privilege to be white, just like that popular YouTube video on how woke and anti or woke and white supremacists are basically the same person. One believes in white privilege, the other believes it's a privilege to be white. Basically the difference. But Christian nationalism is the response that subverted and overtook the white supremacist response. That's why they went from saying white nationalist to Christian nationalist, because we won. Christians pointed to they pointed to a alternative vision that we can build towards, that the white nationalists or white supremacists really didn't do that. The Republican Party isn't doing that. The boomercon neocons aren't doing that. But Christian nationalism is providing the alternative. Is Christian nationalism white wokeism? Another James Lindsay argument here. In 2017, social justice advocates were happy to avoid answering questions about implications of their ideology, asserting that no one could adequately define terms. Words like critical race theory, wokeism, and social justice were obscured by a cacophony of subjective definitions. Similarly, the flurry of differing ideas and associated with Christian nationalism allows many of the of its proponents to argue again that while they hold Christian nationalism, their definitions differ from the one currently being used, thus making criticism moot. Many would contend that the struggle for social justice and the propagation of the Christian nationalism share no similarities. I disagree. Both are responses to the feelings of subjugation and powerlessness. Each seeks a top-down government-facilitated remedy for their concerns. Both are willing to cede authority to the government for the benefit of their respective peoples. Both parties recognize their constitutional powers, such as First Amendment, must be constrained to advance their cause. Though Christian nationalists and those striving for social justice have different ideas of justice, the common good, and the benefit of the societies they would create, they do have a common goal. Both seek to create a utopian vision of a society where people are safe, prosperous, and empowered. I think I want to work backwards from here, because he acts like Christian nationalism is this new thing. I think the term is new, but the ideology is not new. This theology is not new. And there's a lot, everyone before, modern classical liberalism basically in the church basically believed that the power of the sword should enforce the second table of the law and to varying degrees the first table of the law, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, this notion of and this notion that just the notion of their understanding of the First Amendment versus what the understanding of the First Amendment was when it was written is just entirely disconnected. But that's a Herculean task of overcoming that.
Well, I also think the Constitution's moot at this point. It's a dead letter. It's, just a piece of paper. It didn't protect our freedoms the last few years. So all these appeals to the First Amendment and all that is kind of moot to me. It doesn't.
Well,
it rings hollow.
And let's just be honest: the difference between the grievances of the woke crowd and the grievances of the so-called Christian nationalist is
he's drawing a moral equivalency.
Only one side has legitimate grievances, and
right. The other side wants to diddle.
Yeah.
Like these aren't equal grievances.
They want to.
We have a globo homo nationalism in this country, or tranny nationalism.
They want to introduce their morality. They want to introduce their gods. They want to basically force their religion on everyone,
Yeah.
and they want to destroy society in a sense. They want to,
We're
and
not
again, a lot
and
of
we're
it's
not creating a utopian vision of society. We're just going I think we're just reforming. We want to reform something, and English common law would be what we start at, which America already had. This is not about creating a utopian vision for society. It's about reforming our society back to the Christian principles in our specific context, back to the Christian principles that our society was founded on, the Christian legal system of English common law, and then modernizing it because modern solutions require or modern problems require modern solutions, as Dave Chappelle famously said.
but again, the racial grievances of the critical race theories, they're not real. It's just a means to obtain power. They don't actually have legitimate grievances.
Yes.
The disparities between economic outcomes and criminal outcomes are entirely determined by group subcultural attitudes.
Right. And one thing that, the cultural Marxists are right about is this is a win or lose situation. It's a zero sum game. They believe that power is a zero sum game. And you know what? They're pretty much right about that. That is where we're at. That is where we've been at for several years, decades, maybe always have been. But power is a zero sum game. And that's the woke believe that, but it's actually true. They're just serving their father, the devil. Uh, While Christian nationalism and social justice share commonalities, CN is not white wokeism. It is, however, a response to wokeness. Many CN proponents have rightly been concerned as they've witnessed the legalization of same-sex marriage and the embrace of critical race theory, intersectionality, and the legalization of grooming through Drag Queen Story Hour. Some have grown tired of carrying the weight of the social justice onslaught, and or as every cultural disparity is blamed on white supremacy and racism, many view Christian nationalism as a muscular response to these issues, like the Giga Chad. However, there's a biblical response to these issues that does not require embracing nationalism, which is really his bugaboo. So now we get another thing defining nationalism. Uh, there are questions that must be asked here. This is a part later. Who defines who is and who is not a false teacher, a heretic, or a blasphemer? Will the Presbyterians decide? Will the Baptists decide? What will be done with Mormons, Catholics, or Muslims in a Christian nation? If we have determined the state religion is Christian, how can others express their faith? Well, in American history, we actually have something called the Mormon Wars, where they drove the Mormons out of New York. They drove the Mormons out of Missouri, and the Mormons had to go off to Utah to practice their weird sex cult.
I mean,
So,
again, I do bring this up in my critique of Wolf. Um, so I say you have a lot of denominations that didn't exist when the America was formed. Obviously,
yes.
you have new ideologies and theologies that emerge, and then
Other differences would be a lot of immigrants brought, Evangelical Free Church, for instance, is largely Swedish immigrants who came here and built that church here. So there's a lot of that as well.
and the other thing I kind of end with is the question there does remain the question of whether actual heretics would be condemned, and unfortunately, these heretics run the largest churches in America. So that's kind of where I kind of critique Wolf's position, is that a lot of these the heretics have a lot of power in the American church. So there are practicality or practical issues with
Right.
implementing this ideology. There are. That's a legitimate grievance. And I point that out in my review. Doesn't mean you have to throw out the book, the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But that is just something that needs to be discussed, is how would a society go about implementing this. Though one thing I posit is that if you were enforcing the second table of the law, that would probably clear out a lot of the heretics.
Yeah,
So,
probably.
so
Like who's that pastor in South Carolina that just cheats on his wife rampantly? Like John Gray, I think is his name, of the other Transformation Church. In this version, Christian nationalism, believing something contrary to the civil magistrate is permissible. However, there will be prohibitions from expressing it publicly. Wolff acknowledges that one cannot be compelled to believe, which is to his credit. However, public expression of belief is contrary to Wolff's Christian nation. Once protected by the First Amendment, may now be considered an offense against the souls of God's people and punished as a crime. There we go, equating the First Amendment with the law of God.
Oh, can we also point out that God's people are only the elect? So is he referring to everyone as God's people?
Yeah, I don't know.
So that's
I think theologically, Virgil Walker would be right on this. Unfortunately, Wolff's version of nationalism maintains consistency with a kind of German Volkism, which is peopleism, that paved the way for ethnic German nationalism. While opponents may balk at the comparison, Wolff embraces the idea when he writes, "Blood relations matter for your ethnicity because your kin have belonged to this people on this land, to this nation in this place, and so they bind you, that people and place, creating a common Volksgeist," which is I don't know what the Geist means in German. Volks means
I
people.
could see. I can see if I can find the quote. But
Uh,
obviously,
I'll keep reading. Wolff uses similar language of blood and soil, blood and place, when describing his ethnic group as those with a genetic connection and those who have been on the land. You see, nationalism has consistently embraced ethno-nationalism, which favors one group known to our people over others. This form of ethno-nationalism can be seen in history as German nationalism has justified its actions against people deemed undesirable or inferior. Like again, the Germans, like nationalism wasn't the worst part, or at least revanchism was like not the worst part about the Nazis.
I
The
mean, this
worst part
is.
was like the socialist economy and the obviously the ethno genocide and stuff like that. But the nationalism didn't necessarily lead to that, just because nationalism didn't lead to that in other places where it's been tried. So there's something about the unique German experience, and what is that? Because they were Darwinist. So we got to remember that
Also their Christianity was overtaken by
they
pietism.
didn't have, yeah.
So I mean and then of course, obviously they had a failed government, the Kaiser, and their church was also state ran. So you had a lot of different
Or
factors that are,
Catholic.
yeah, a lot of different factors that aren't even relevant to America. I mean,
So
I know when he talks about, like, obviously the notion of the whole kinist chapter. I mean, trying to see, um, a lot, a lot of when they call him a kinist, obviously they're just going to call him that. And let's just be honest with
okay.
ourselves. Interracial relationships do bring with them unique challenges.
Okay, Robert points out that Geist is the spirit of the times, like Zeitgeist. Uh, Protestant Anon says the Nazis were doing the bidding of the Roman Catholic Church. I do think yeah, I think that Adolf Hitler claimed Catholicism at times, but I think that the SS was pretty much all degenerate. Like, they were having some gay orgies and stuff and doing occultic practices. Let's see. Let's just read his conclusion and wrap up. As an Air Force veteran, I have raised my right hand and sworn to protect and defend the United States Constitution. I'm familiar with patriotism and national pride. Despite all of its current faults, America remains a beacon of freedom and hope. Those of us who have donned a military uniform and voluntarily placed ourselves in harm's way to defend the liberties we enjoy are devoted to enhancing the American experience. I don't see America as a beacon of liberty and of freedom and hope, and I don't think the rest of the world sees America that way either.
I mean,
See us as a beacon of global homosexuality.
our military recruitment numbers disprove that statement. But it's also the appeal to I served this country. Well, okay, so what?
Yeah, I mean,
That was what
yeah, I don't
20
like
years.
the appeal to veteran fallacy,
And no, I mean, some of
which
our
is,
work. Let's just be honest. John McCain was a veteran. He was a piece of crap. So let's just
I mean,
stop. putting.
his record wasn't actually. He was probably the worst Navy pilot, and he was the worst pilot in Navy history, arguably.
I mean, there are good veterans and bad veterans, but I mean, it doesn't. You don't have a moral badge of honor just because you served. Sorry, it might be offensive to say that, but
And then for the past few years, as CRTI, social justice, and wokeism made their way through evangelicalism, I've been committed to pushing back against the racist ideology represented by Black liberation theologians and Black Lives Matter advocates. Why does he capitalize that, but lowercase is all these other things? I reject the idea that only my hope to win the battles that we face is through some form of Christian nationalism. The weapons of our warfare have divine power to destroy ideological strongholds. Current answers notwithstanding, I'll stick with what works. The gospel of Jesus Christ and well-equipped believers living out their faith in the public square. We must not grow weary as we continue to be a prophetic voice to a sinful culture. And again, I would argue that equipping believers living out their faith in the public square entails Christian nationalism. I would argue that there's a connection between the two.
I mean, it's kind of a glorified gospel juke at the end. And, yeah, we just got to go out there and preach the gospel. Well, if you read the Gospel Coalition's article, you don't confront your school board members when they're promoting degeneracy.
Brian Babes says, for the globe world, especially poor countries, America is a beacon of hope. That's why you always have different kinds of nationalities moving here. And I think that is true, but you know what nation has the second highest immigration? Russia. So America's number one. I don't know how distant number 1 and 2 are, but number 2 is Russia.
But I mean, again, people that immigrate to America are doing it for different reasons. Because economic opportunity's always been number one.
Right.
And let's be honest, when a lot of the mass migration that when they're talking about, we got to have this multi-ethnic society, well, technically, Black people are the third racial group in America. Hispanics overtook them.
Oh, are they white Hispanics, or which is a term they invented for George Floyd? Nobody from Africa is going to Russia. I think that's true, though. I do think that is 100% true.
They're not going to China either.
No, they're not going to China
or
either.
Japan.
That's true. I don't know where it's coming from. I'm just saying that number 2 in that is that. So I'm not entirely convinced that immigration. I've never seen a Black Russian, but have you drank one? But anyway, and obviously I guess the UK would be somewhere on there. I do wonder, like, what is the driving forces of immigration, but I'm not entirely convinced that nowadays people see freedom as the driving force. I think at one point that was true, but I don't think that's true right now as much as it is, economic opportunity and stuff like that. I mean, I work with a lot of, I work in IT, so I'll just leave it at that. But economic opportunity is huge. If, you're Indian or Nepali and you know how to work computers, there's a lot of, high paying jobs of that caliber in this country.
But again, it's a Christian nationalist talking point to say that, the importation of mass amounts of people, which, turned California deep blue, being exported to the rest of America will not make our country more depraved, even if these so-called people possess Christian beliefs.
Yeah. And, to be honest, I think Christianity should be a vetting point for immigration.
But that's Christian nationalism.
That is Christian nationalism. So it was certainly a vetting point for admitting states. They had to have Christian laws in place.
And not polygamy.
Yeah, that was a biggie, which I know Brian Babes and I have some disagreements on the doctrine of polygamy, so I think that's pretty funny that she's in here. But anyway, I think that's basically all we've got to talk about. I'll have to think about whether I want to split this stream into like multiple videos or something, but we'll show. No, I probably won't. That's too much work. But anyway, it's been fun. I don't think I'm going to do a last call on questions. But otherwise, have a blessed day, and we'll catch you on the next one. Next week, we got Sam Jones joining us, hopefully, to discuss Christian nationalism as it relates to America's founding versus classical liberalism. So that should be a fun time. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you are new. Have a blessed day. Again, we'll catch you on the next one.